autumn of 1876, in the rural Kentucky hill country near the town of Hazard, two elderly sisters named Catherine and Margaret Thornton, both in their early 60s, began experiencing a medical phenomenon that would baffle physicians and challenge everything that 19th-century science understood about human aging and development. Over the course of 18 months, the sisters appeared to physically regress through decades of their lives, their bodies gradually transforming from elderly women to middle-aged, then to young adults, and eventually to what observers described as the physical state of adolescence, all while their minds remained fully mature and conscious of the impossible transformation occurring to them. Three prominent physicians who examined the sisters throughout this period documented their observations with meticulous detail, filling journals with measurements, photographs, and descriptions of changes that violated every known principle of human biology. The women's gray hair gradually returned to its original dark brown color, deep wrinkles smoothed away, revealing younger skin beneath, age spots faded and disappeared, their posture straightened as spines that had curved with decades of life somehow unbent, joints that had been stiff and painful with arthritis became flexible again, their voices, which had grown thin and raspy with age, deepened and strengthened, returning to the tones of youth. Most disturbing to those who witnessed this transformation was not just the physical regression itself, but the psychological torment it caused the sisters. Catherine and Margaret had lived full lives, had married and raised families, had experienced loss and joy across 6 decades of existence. They possessed all the memories, wisdom, and mental development of elderly women, but as their bodies regressed, they found themselves trapped in an increasingly profound disconnect between their physical appearance and their internal reality, between how the world saw them and who they actually were. When the transformation finally stopped in the spring of 1878, the Thornton sisters appeared to be approximately 20 years old, though they were chronologically in their mid-60s. They would remain in this state for the rest of their lives, their bodies frozen at an age 4 decades younger than their actual years, living evidence of a phenomenon that medical science could not explain, and that would haunt the Kentucky medical community for generations. Before we continue with the impossible story of Catherine and Margaret Thornton, the sisters who defied the fundamental laws of human aging, subscribe to Shadows of America and hit that notification bell. We release hour-long investigations every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Let us know in the comments what state you're watching from, and share this video with someone who needs to hear these forgotten stories. The Kentucky Hill Country in the 1870s was an isolated region where communities were scattered across rugged terrain, connected by rough roads that became impassable during winter months. The people who lived in these mountains were primarily descendants of settlers who had moved into the region in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, establishing small farms in valleys and on hillsides, living lives that had changed little over generations. Medical care was scarce, with physicians few and far between, and most people relied on traditional remedies and home treatments for illnesses and injuries. Catherine and Margaret Thornton had been born in 1814, twin daughters of a farming family that had settled in Perry County in the 1790s. They had grown up during the early years of Kentucky statehood, had lived through the dramatic social changes of the antebellum period, had witnessed the Civil War and its aftermath, and by 1876 had reached what they and everyone around them assumed would be the final years of their lives. Both women had married in their 20s, Catherine to a farmer named James Wheeler, Margaret to a merchant named Thomas Hayes. Both had raised families, Catherine bearing 6 children, of whom 4 survived to adulthood, Margaret bearing 5 children, of whom 3 survived. By the time they reached their 60s, both sisters had been widowed, Catherine losing her husband to pneumonia in 1872, Margaret losing hers to a farming accident in 1874. They had decided to live together in a small house on land that had belonged to their family for decades, supporting themselves through a combination of small farming, taking in sewing work, and assistance from their adult children who lived nearby. They were known in the community as respectable elderly women, devout Methodists who attended church regularly, skilled with traditional medicine and midwifery, often called upon to help with births or to care for sick neighbors. In appearance and health, they were typical women of their age and circumstances. Both showed the physical signs of 6 decades of hard rural life. Their hair had gone completely gray. Deep lines marked their faces from years of sun exposure and the natural processes of aging. They moved slowly, their joints stiff with arthritis that was common among people who had spent their lives in physical labor. Their vision had weakened, requiring them to sit close to windows for adequate light when doing needlework. Their hearing had diminished, particularly Margaret's, who had to ask people to repeat themselves in conversation. They tired easily, no longer able to work for extended periods without rest. The first sign that something unusual was happening came in October of 1876, when Catherine noticed that several of her gray hairs appeared to have darker roots, as if new growth was coming in with a different color. She mentioned this to Margaret, who examined her sister's hair and confirmed the observation. They initially dismissed it as a curiosity, perhaps some change in diet or exposure to well water affecting hair pigmentation. But over the following weeks, more dark hair appeared, and the sisters began to notice other small changes that seemed unusual but not yet alarming. Catherine mentioned to Margaret that the pain in her hands from arthritis seemed to be improving, that she could grip and manipulate needles and thread more easily than she had been able to for years. Margaret noticed that she was having less difficulty reading, that text seemed clearer and easier to focus on than it had been. Both women felt they had more energy, that they could work longer without becoming exhausted, that they slept less soundly at night, as if their bodies needed less rest. By December, the changes had become pronounced enough that family members began to comment on them. Catherine's daughter Elizabeth mentioned that her mother seemed to be walking more upright, that the stoop she had developed over recent years appeared to be lessening. Margaret's son Thomas remarked that his mother's face looked different, smoother somehow, though he couldn't quite identify what had changed. The sisters themselves were becoming aware that something significant was happening to them, something that went beyond normal variations in health or appearance. It was Margaret's son who first suggested that they should consult a physician. Samuel Morrison practiced in Hazard, about 15 miles from the Thornton property, and was known as a competent medical practitioner who had studied at a medical college in Louisville before establishing his practice in the mountains. In January of 1877, Thomas Hayes arranged for Dr. Morrison to visit his mother and aunt, explaining that both women seemed to be experiencing unusual health changes that the family couldn't understand. Dr. Morrison's initial examination found both women in remarkably good health for their ages. Their vital signs were strong, their organ function appeared normal, and they showed none of the common ailments that typically afflicted people in their 60s. What struck Morrison most forcefully was that both women appeared younger than their stated ages. When told they were 62 years old, he expressed surprise, saying they looked more like women in their 50s. The sisters showed him photographs that had been taken several years earlier, and Morrison could see clear differences between the older images and the women now sitting before him. Over the following months, Dr. Morrison made regular visits to the Thornton house, documenting changes that became increasingly dramatic and increasingly impossible to explain through any conventional medical framework. By March of 1877, both women's hair had returned almost entirely to dark brown, with only a few remaining gray strands. The deep wrinkles that had marked their faces had softened significantly, making them appear decades younger. Age spots that had covered their hands had faded almost to invisibility. Their posture had straightened to the point where they stood as tall and erect as women in their prime adult years. Morrison brought in two colleagues, Dr. James Whitfield from Lexington and Dr. Robert Preston from Louisville, both of whom had reputations as skilled diagnosticians and researchers. The three physicians conducted extensive examinations of the Thornton sisters in May of 1877, taking detailed measurements, performing various medical tests available at the time, and documenting every aspect of the women's appearance and physical condition. What they found was unprecedented in medical literature. The sisters' skin had regained elasticity and firmness associated with much younger women. Their muscle tone had improved dramatically, with strength returning that had been lost to decades of aging. Their joints moved freely, without pain or stiffness. Their vision and hearing had improved to levels typical of middle-aged rather than elderly individuals. Even their teeth, which had shown the wear and decay common in people their age, appeared to be in better condition, though the physicians couldn't explain how deteriorated enamel could somehow restore itself. Most remarkably, when the physicians compared current measurements to those taken by Dr. Morrison in January, they found that both women had actually grown taller by approximately 2 inches, as if spines that had compressed over decades of life were somehow expanding again. This finding was so improbable that the physicians repeated the measurements multiple times to verify their accuracy, but the results remained consistent. The physicians also documented psychological changes. Both women reported feeling mentally sharper, that their memories seemed clearer and more accessible, that they could think with a speed and clarity that had declined gradually over their later adult years. They spoke of feeling more energetic, more curious about the world, more engaged with life, in ways that resembled how they had felt decades earlier. Yet they retained all their memories and life experiences, remaining fully aware that they were elderly women, despite their increasingly youthful physical state. By the summer of 1877, the transformation had progressed to the point where both women appeared to be in their 40s rather than their 60s. Family members struggled to adjust to the dramatic change in their appearance. Catherine's adult children found it deeply unsettling to see their mother looking younger than some of them, to watch her physical regression, while knowing that mentally and emotionally she remained their elderly parent. Margaret's children experienced similar disorientation, uncertain how to relate to a mother who increasingly resembled a sister or even a daughter in appearance, while retaining the wisdom and authority of her actual age. The sisters themselves found the transformation profoundly disturbing. They experienced a growing disconnect between their physical bodies and their sense of self, between how others now perceived them and who they actually were. Strangers who met them assumed they were young women and treated them accordingly, speaking to them with less respect than would be shown to their elders, making assumptions about their capabilities and experiences that bore no relationship to their actual 6 decades of life. This constant misalignment between appearance and reality created psychological stress that grew more severe as the physical regression continued. The medical community became increasingly aware of the Thornton case through Dr. Morrison's detailed reports and correspondence with colleagues. By August of 1877, the case had attracted attention from physicians across Kentucky and beyond, with several requesting permission to examine the sisters themselves. The Thornton women, who valued their privacy and found the constant medical attention exhausting, reluctantly agreed to allow additional examinations, understanding that their condition was scientifically important, even as they struggled with its personal impact. One physician who examined them in September of 1877, a specialist in aging and development, named Dr. Charles Henderson from Philadelphia, attempted to explain the phenomenon through the theory of cellular regeneration. He hypothesized that some unknown trigger had activated processes in the sisters' bodies that were reversing cellular aging, that their cells were somehow renewing themselves in ways that typically only occurred during growth and development. But Henderson admitted that this theory raised more questions than it answered. What could trigger such a process? Why would it affect both sisters simultaneously? How could complex changes like bone lengthening and tooth improvement occur in already developed adult bodies? Other physicians proposed different theories. Some suggested that the sisters had never actually been 62 years old, that there had been some error in birth records, and they were actually much younger than they believed. But this theory was quickly disproven by extensive documentation, including church baptism records, family Bibles with recorded births, and testimony from community members who had known the sisters their entire lives and could verify their ages. Some speculated about dietary factors or environmental exposures that might be triggering the changes, but careful investigation revealed nothing unusual about the sisters' food, water, or living conditions that could account for such dramatic physical regression. Others wondered whether some illness or medical condition might be responsible, but examination showed both women to be in excellent health with no signs of disease or disorder. The most disturbing theory, proposed by a few physicians willing to consider supernatural explanations, was that the sisters were experiencing some form of curse or divine intervention, that their reversal of aging represented forces beyond natural law. This theory was dismissed by most medical professionals as unscientific superstition, but it reflected the profound unease that the case created, the sense that what was happening to the Thornton sisters violated fundamental principles about how the world worked. By the end of 1877, both Catherine and Margaret appeared to be approximately 30 years old, their bodies having regressed through more than 3 decades in just over a year. The transformation continued into early 1878, with both women looking progressively younger with each passing month. By March of 1878, they appeared to be in their mid-20s, and by April, they seemed to be barely out of adolescence, looking like young women of perhaps 20 years old, despite their chronological age of 63. Then, quite suddenly, in May of 1878, the regression stopped. The sisters' appearance stabilized at what appeared to be approximately 20 years of age, and remained there. They continued to be examined regularly by physicians hoping to understand whether the changes would resume or reverse, but their physical state remained constant. They had regressed approximately 40 years in their physical appearance and biological age, and that state appeared to be permanent. The psychological impact of living in this condition was profound and complex. The sisters now existed in a state of permanent temporal displacement, their minds and memories, those of women in their 60s, their bodies, those of young women barely out of adolescence. Every interaction with the world required them to navigate the disconnect between appearance and reality, to explain to people who assumed they were young that they were actually elderly, to assert authority and wisdom that their youthful appearance seemed to contradict. Their adult children, who had initially been shocked and disturbed by the transformation, gradually adjusted to the strange reality of having mothers who looked younger than they did. But the relationship dynamics had been permanently altered. It became difficult for the children to maintain the respect and deference typically shown to elderly parents when those parents appeared younger than their own adult offspring. Family gatherings became awkward affairs where generations seemed reversed, where the natural order of aging and family hierarchy had been disrupted in ways that no one knew how to address. The sisters' social position in the community also changed dramatically. They had been respected elderly women, their age conferring status and authority, their opinions valued, their experience acknowledged. But now they looked like young women, and the community struggled with how to treat them. Some neighbors continued to show them the respect due to their actual age and life experience, but others found it impossible to separate appearance from reality, and treated them as they would treat any 20-year-old women, with less deference and different expectations. Most disturbing was the attention the sisters received from men. Before their transformation, they had been elderly widows, no longer objects of romantic or sexual interest, but now they appeared young, and by the standards of the time, attractive. Men who had known them as old women found themselves uncomfortable with new feelings that seemed inappropriate given the sisters' actual ages. Younger men who didn't know their history sometimes approached them with romantic interest that the sisters found deeply unsettling, creating situations where they had to explain their true ages to men who could barely comprehend the impossible reality they described. The sisters attempted to continue living as they had before the transformation, maintaining their household, doing their needlework, attending church, and participating in community activities. But everything had become more difficult. At church, people who knew their true ages struggled to treat them appropriately, while visitors and new community members assumed they were young women and questioned why they sat with the elderly rather than with their own apparent age group. When they tried to offer advice or guidance based on their decades of life experience, younger people sometimes dismissed their words because they looked like peers rather than elders. The medical examinations continued for years, with physicians hoping that long-term observation might reveal insights about the phenomenon. But the sisters' condition remained stable, their appearance unchanging, their bodies apparently locked in a state of perpetual youth, while their minds continued to age normally. By 1880, they were 65 years old chronologically, but appeared to be 20 physically, and nothing in their condition suggested that this would ever change. Dr. Morrison, who had been documenting their case from the beginning, published a detailed medical report in 1881, describing the entire progression of their transformation. The report was published in a regional medical journal and created significant controversy. Some physicians accepted Morrison's observations as accurate documentation of a genuine unexplained phenomenon. Others suggested that Morrison had been deceived or had misinterpreted normal variations in appearance. Still others attacked the report as fraudulent, claiming that no such reversal of aging was biologically possible, and that Morrison must be either lying or suffering from delusions. The controversy led to a formal investigation by the Kentucky Medical Society, which sent a committee of physicians to examine the Thornton sisters and evaluate Morrison's claims. The committee spent a week conducting examinations, interviewing witnesses, reviewing documentation, and attempting to find any evidence of fraud or misrepresentation. Their report, issued in late 1881, confirmed that Morrison's observations were accurate, that the sisters did indeed appear to be in their 20s, despite verified documentation of their being in their mid-60s, and that no conventional medical explanation could account for their condition. However, the committee's report also acknowledged that they could not explain what they had observed. They documented the phenomenon, but offered no theory about its cause or mechanism. The report ended with a recommendation for continued observation and study, with the hope that future advances in medical science might eventually provide an explanation that was currently beyond reach. The Thornton sisters lived with their unusual condition for the rest of their lives, which were much longer than they or anyone else had expected. Having physically regressed to their 20s, they possessed the physical health and vitality of young women, and this translated into an extended lifespan that defied normal expectations. Catherine lived until 1909, dying at the age of 94, but appearing to be in her 50s, having aged only partially and slowly from the 20-year-old state she had reached in 1878. Margaret survived even longer, living until 1912 and dying at age 97, also having aged only partially from her youthful appearance. Throughout their extended lives, the sisters struggled with the psychological burden of their condition. They watched their children age and die, saw grandchildren, and even some great-grandchildren grow old, while they themselves remained relatively youthful in appearance. They experienced multiple generations of community members who knew them as old women, transformed into young, then gradually aging again, but never catching up to their chronological age. The temporal displacement they experienced never fully resolved, creating a permanent sense of being out of sync with the world around them. The sisters also faced practical challenges related to their condition. As they aged chronologically but not physically, questions arose about how to document their true ages. Official records showed them as elderly women, but their appearance suggested they were much younger. This created difficulties with legal and financial matters, with inheritance issues, with medical care, where physicians who didn't know their history made assumptions based on appearance rather than actual age. Perhaps most painful was the loneliness their condition created. They had each other, which provided some comfort, but they became increasingly isolated from normal social connections. Their peers from their actual generation had all aged and died normally, leaving the sisters as the only survivors of their cohort. But they couldn't easily form connections with people who appeared to be their physical age, because the generational and experiential gaps were too vast. They existed in a kind of temporal isolation, belonging fully to neither their chronological generation nor the physical age their bodies suggested. The medical mystery of the Thornton sisters was never solved during their lifetimes or in the decades immediately following their deaths. Their case became a footnote in medical history, occasionally cited in discussions of unusual aging phenomena, but generally dismissed as probably misreported or misunderstood. Skeptics suggested that the sisters had never actually aged backwards, that the whole story was a combination of exaggeration, wishful thinking, and community legend building around normal variations in how people age. But the documentation was extensive and came from multiple credible sources. The photographs taken throughout the transformation period, showing the sisters at various stages of their regression, were examined by later researchers and found to be genuine period photographs with no evidence of manipulation or fraud. The medical reports filed by Morrison, Whitfield, Preston, and the Kentucky Medical Society Committee were detailed and specific, describing observations that could not easily be dismissed as errors or fabrications. Modern medical researchers who have reviewed the historical documentation of the Thornton case generally acknowledge that something unusual occurred, but remain deeply divided about what that something was. Some suggest that the sisters might have suffered from a rare condition affecting their connective tissue and appearance, creating the illusion of age reversal without actual biological regression. Others propose that they might have experienced a form of progeria in reverse, a genetic condition causing rapid aging that somehow went into remission or reversal. A few researchers have suggested that the case might represent genuine biological age reversal, triggered by some unknown factor, perhaps a spontaneous genetic mutation, or activation of dormant cellular regeneration capabilities. This theory is highly speculative and not supported by current understanding of human biology, but the Thornton case remains one of very few documented instances where the appearance of age reversal was observed and recorded by multiple credible witnesses over an extended period. The psychological aspects of the case have attracted particular interest from modern researchers. The experience of rapid physical regression while maintaining normal mental aging represents a profound form of body dysmorphia and identity disruption. The sisters struggle to maintain their sense of self while their bodies transformed, their difficulty navigating social interactions where appearance and reality were completely misaligned, and their long-term adjustment to living in a state of permanent temporal displacement all provide insights into how identity, embodiment, and social perception interact. Some psychologists have suggested that similar experiences, though less dramatic, occur in various medical conditions where appearance and internal experience become misaligned. People with conditions that make them appear much older or younger than their actual age, individuals whose illness changes their appearance dramatically, and those undergoing major physical transformations through accident or medical intervention, all face challenges comparable to what the Thornton sisters experienced, navigating worlds where how they look and who they are don't align. The broader question raised by the Thornton case is what it means to age, and what role physical appearance plays in identity and social position. The sisters' experience demonstrated how deeply age and appearance are intertwined in social interaction. How much of our identity and how others treat us depends on visible markers of age rather than on actual experience or chronological time. Their inability to claim the respect and status appropriate to their years simply because they didn't look old, revealed how much aging is a social performance as well as a biological process. The case also raises questions about whether age reversal, if it were possible, would actually be desirable. The Thornton sisters' experience suggests that physical rejuvenation without social and experiential alignment might create more problems than it solved, that being young in body, while old in mind and memory, might be more curse than blessing. Their loneliness, their alienation, their struggle to maintain connections and identity, all suggest that aging, for all its challenges, serves important functions in maintaining continuity of self and social relationships. When Catherine died in 1909, her obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of her unusual aging history, describing her simply as a long-time resident and mother of 4. Those who had witnessed her transformation had mostly died themselves by then, and the younger generation knew only that Catherine looked unusually young for her stated age. The medical documentation of her case remained in archives, occasionally cited but generally forgotten. Margaret's death 3 years later was similarly unremarkable in its public acknowledgement. She was buried next to her sister in the family cemetery, their shared headstone giving their birth and death dates, without any indication of the impossible transformation they had undergone in the intervening years. The headstone remains there today, marking the graves of 2 women who experienced something that medical science still cannot fully explain or account for. The house where the sisters lived during their transformation still stands, though it has been modified and updated by subsequent owners. There is no historical marker indicating its significance, no acknowledgement of the medical mystery that unfolded within its walls. The family that currently occupies the house has some vague awareness of a legend about previous residents who supposedly aged backwards, but they treat it as local folklore rather than documented history. The medical journals kept by Dr. Morrison and his colleagues are preserved in the archives of the University of Louisville Medical Library, where they are occasionally consulted by researchers interested in unusual medical cases from the 19th century. The photographs taken during the sisters' transformation are also preserved there, providing visual documentation that continues to intrigue and puzzle those who study them. Modern attempts to explain the Thornton case have produced various theories, but no definitive conclusions. Genetic researchers have speculated about whether the sisters might have carried mutations affecting cellular aging, but without biological samples for testing, this remains pure speculation. Endocrinologists have suggested possible hormonal disorders that might have affected their appearance without actually reversing their biological age, but the dramatic nature of the observed changes seems to exceed what hormonal fluctuations could produce. Some researchers have proposed that the case might represent a form of mass hysteria or shared delusion, where witnesses convinced themselves they were seeing age reversal when actually observing normal variations in health and appearance. But this theory struggles to account for the photographic evidence and the detailed medical measurements that documented specific quantifiable changes over time. Perhaps the most honest assessment comes from medical historians who acknowledge that the Thornton case represents a genuine mystery, an observation of phenomena that cannot be explained by current medical knowledge or dismissed as simple misperception. Whether the sisters actually experienced biological age reversal or whether their case represents some other unusual condition remains unknown, but the documentation is sufficient to establish that something extraordinary occurred. The case has occasionally been cited in discussions of aging research and the possibility of developing interventions that might slow, stop, or even reverse aging processes. Some researchers working on cellular senescence and regeneration point to the Thornton case as suggestive evidence that age reversal might be biologically possible under certain conditions, even if we don't yet understand what those conditions are or how to recreate them. Others dismiss such citations as wishful thinking based on an imperfectly documented historical case that probably involved factors other than actual age reversal. What remains clear from the historical record is that Catherine and Margaret Thornton experienced something that profoundly disrupted their lives, that changed how they appeared and how they moved through the world, and that created psychological and social challenges they struggled with for decades. Whether their experience represented true biological age reversal or some other phenomenon, it fundamentally altered their existence in ways that were both extraordinary and deeply difficult. The sisters' story also serves as a reminder that medical science, for all its advances, still encounters phenomena it cannot explain. The human body remains in many ways mysterious, capable of variations and conditions that challenge our understanding of what is biologically possible. The Thornton case stands as one example among many throughout medical history of observations that don't fit neatly into existing frameworks, that resist explanation even as they demand to be taken seriously as genuine phenomena rather than dismissed as error or fraud. For those interested in the boundaries of human biology, in the limits of what we know about aging and development, and in the psychological experience of radical physical transformation, the Thornton case provides a fascinating and unsettling example. It asks us to consider what would happen if the seemingly irreversible process of aging could somehow be reversed, what that would mean for identity and relationships, and whether such reversal would be the blessing it might initially seem, or a more complex and troubling disruption of normal human experience. The case also reminds us that appearance and reality don't always align, that visible signs of age don't necessarily correspond to actual experience or capability, and that we make many assumptions based on how people look that may not reflect who they actually are. In this sense, the Thornton sisters' experience, whether it involved true age reversal or not, provides insights into how we perceive and categorize people based on physical appearance, and how difficult it can be to navigate a world where those visible markers don't match internal reality. The loneliness and isolation the sisters experienced also speaks to broader questions about aging and community. They found themselves cut off from their generational cohort by their changed appearance, unable to maintain the social connections and positions appropriate to their actual age and experience. This suggests how much of our social world is organized around age-based categories and expectations, and how disruptive it can be when those categories break down or become misaligned. In the end, the Thornton sisters lived lives that were far longer than expected, but also far more complicated and difficult than they would have been without their unusual transformation. They experienced physical rejuvenation that most people would envy, but they also experienced isolation, displacement, and a persistent sense of being out of sync with the world around them. Their story suggests that youth and age are not simply biological states, but are deeply embedded in social relationships, personal identity, and how we understand ourselves in relation to time and mortality. Whether future science will ever be able to explain what happened to Catherine and Margaret Thornton remains uncertain. The case stands in historical record as a puzzle, an observation of phenomena that challenged medical understanding in the 1870s and that continue to resist complete explanation today. The sisters themselves went to their graves without ever understanding why they had experienced what they did, knowing only that their lives had been profoundly altered by a transformation that should not have been possible, but that had nevertheless occurred. Their graves in that small Kentucky cemetery mark the resting places of two women who lived through one of the most unusual medical cases ever documented, who experienced something that violated fundamental assumptions about human biology and aging, and who carried the burden of that experience for decades longer than normal lifespans would have allowed. Their story remains a mystery, a challenge to our understanding, and a reminder that the world sometimes presents us with phenomena that exceed our ability to explain or comprehend. What do you think about this case? Could the Thornton sisters have actually experienced biological age reversal, or must there be some other explanation? If age reversal were possible, would it be desirable, or would the psychological and social costs make it more curse than blessing? What does this case tell us about the relationship between appearance and identity? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe to Shadows of America. We release documentaries like this every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Hit that like button, share this video, and let us know what state you're watching from. The past is never truly buried, it's just waiting in the shadows.